Back in the late 60s, when I was a young, wide-eyed trooper stationed in Vietnam, I experienced things that I've never been able to shake. The war itself was hell on earth, but what came afterward, what the Vietnamese did to us, well, that was something out of a nightmare. I don't speak of it often. It's easier to let people think it was the usual horrors of war. But those of us who survived know different. We were captured, held in a place that made hell look like a vacation. We were their prisoners, but more than that, we were their experiments. I remember the day they captured us, dragging us through the dense jungle, the stench of sweat and fear clinging to us like a second skin. They didn't bother with blindfolds. They wanted us to see where we were going, wanted us to understand that no one was coming for us. The camp was hidden deep in the jungle, a fortress of bamboo and despair, guarded by men whose eyes held nothing but cold indifference. They threw us into pits, dark and damp, where we could barely move without brushing against another soldier. All of us huddled together like livestock awaiting slaughter. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and we began to lose track of time. That's when the experiments started. They would drag us, one by one, from the pits and into their makeshift lab, a small hut at the edge of the camp, where the scent of blood and chemicals hung heavy in the air. The first time they took me, I was too weak to resist, my limbs like lead as they strapped me down to a metal table. The scientist in charge, a thin man with sharp features and dead eyes, loomed over me, his breath rancid as he muttered to himself in Vietnamese. The first experiment was simple, or so it seemed. They injected me with something, a thick, black liquid that burned as it coursed through my veins. First, nothing happened. I thought maybe they were just testing our pain thresholds, seeing how much we could endure before we broke. But then the hallucinations began. I saw things, twisted and grotesque, shadows moving in the corners of the room, whispering in a language I didn't understand. The scientist just watched, jotting down notes as I thrashed and screamed, my mind unraveling with each passing second. They would leave us like that for hours, trapped in our own personal hells, until the effects wore off. But the worst part was that they always brought us back. It was like a sick game to them, seeing how much we could take before we finally cracked. Some of the guys didn't make it. I watched as strong men I'd fought beside, were reduced to gibbering wrecks, their minds shattered beyond repair. They started seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices in the dark, until they finally just stopped. Their bodies would twitch and spasm, and then they'd go still, their eyes wide open, staring at something only they could see. The experiments grew worse with each passing day. They started cutting us open, right there on the table, digging around inside us like we were nothing more than pieces of meat. They would remove organs, replace them with something else, metal, plastic, things I didn't recognize, and then sew us back up, watching to see how long we could survive. Some of the guys didn't survive long. They would bleed out, choking on their own blood as the scientists just stood there, taking notes. I still don't know how I managed to escape. It was pure luck, or maybe the devil himself was watching over me. One night, during a particularly violent storm, the guards became distracted. The lightning flashed across the sky, and in that moment, I knew it was now or never. I managed to slip out of my bindings, using a piece of jagged metal I'd found on the floor. I don't remember much after that, just running, stumbling through the jungle, the rain lashing against my skin as I fled that cursed place. I made it back to friendly lines somehow, half dead and delirious, and they shipped me home soon after. But even now, after all these years, I can't escape what happened in that camp. The nightmares still haunt me, vivid and unrelenting. I see the faces of the scientists, their cold, calculating eyes as they tore us apart piece by piece. I hear the screams of my comrades, feel the searing pain as they experimented on me again and again. Sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, I can still feel the metal inside me, cold and unyielding, a constant reminder of what they did to us. I survived Vietnam, but a part of me never left that camp. I'm not sure it ever will.
Back in 2012, I was a psychiatrist working in an old, crumbling hospital tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. It wasn't the sort of place anyone would choose to work, but I wasn't anyone. I had a fascination, some might call it an obsession, with the minds that most people would rather forget existed. The hospital was a place where the walls seemed to whisper secrets, and where the air hung heavy with the weight of untold stories. But there was one patient, in particular, who intrigued me more than the rest. Her name was Lily, and she was kept in Ward 68, a place reserved for the most dangerous and disturbed. Lily was different, though. It wasn't just her mind that was fractured, it was as if she had the ability to fracture others. The other patients were terrified of her, whispering about her ability to control their thoughts, their actions, even their nightmares. The staff avoided her room, claiming they heard voices when they got too close. But I wasn't deterred. I was determined to find out what made her tick. One night, after everyone had gone home, I found myself in my office, staring at Lily's file. It was thin, which was strange. No history, no family, no past. Just one note scrawled in the margins: she controls. That was the night I made the deal. I was desperate, willing to do anything to understand Lily. I don't know how it happened, but suddenly, he was there, a figure shrouded in shadows, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. He didn't introduce himself, he didn't need to. I knew who he was. "You want answers," he said, his voice like the crackling of fire. "I can show you." "What do you want in return?" I asked, already knowing the answer but too captivated to care. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that chilled me to the bone. "Once you see, you can never go back." I hesitated, but only for a moment. "Show me." The world shifted then. The walls of my office melted away, replaced by the cold, sterile corridors of the hospital. But something was wrong. The air was thicker, the shadows darker, and the whispers, they were louder. I found myself standing outside Ward 68. The door was ajar, and beyond it, I could see Lily sitting on her bed, staring at the wall. She didn't turn to look at me as I entered, but I felt her eyes on me all the same. "Why do you do it?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain calm. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, the room around me began to warp, twisting and bending until I couldn't tell where the floor ended and the ceiling began. The walls pulsed as if alive, and the shadows on the walls grew faces, faces I recognized. They were the other patients, twisted into grotesque forms, their mouths moving in silent screams. "Lily, stop!" I shouted, but it was no use. The shadows closed in, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I tried to move, to fight back, but my body wouldn't respond. It was then that I realized this wasn't Lily's doing. It was his. "You wanted to know," the devil whispered in my ear, his breath cold against my skin. "And now you do." The scene shifted again, and I was back in my office, but it wasn't the same. The walls were covered in blood-red writing, my own handwriting, repeating the same word over and over: control. Lily stood in the corner, her eyes glowing with the same hellish light as his. "You gave me to him," she said, her voice a low, menacing hiss. "Now you'll never leave." The door to my office slammed shut, and I ran to it, pounding on the wood until my hands bled. But it was no use. The room began to close in on me, the walls tightening, the whispers growing louder until they were all I could hear. That's when I realized the truth. I was never leaving. This was my reality now, a twisted mirror of the world I once knew, where the lines between real and unreal blurred until they didn't exist at all. And I had become just another patient in Ward 68, forever trapped in the nightmare I had created.